Hello everyone and welcome back to JAS Reviews. My name is James and on this channel I do reviews of both music and movies, along with the occasional commentary piece. So if any of that sounds interesting to you, then please be sure to leave this video a like and to subscribe to my channel to see more content like that. And today I am going to be reviewing a movie that I wasn't necessarily planning on seeing, but after seeing all the positive reviews about it, I just had to check it out. And that is the newest in the Saw franchise, Saw 10, or as some people are choosing to call it, Saw X. Now, if you know anything about the Saw movies, then you know that they are very famous for one thing, and that is their torture scenes and their infamous traps that can range from pretty creative to outright demented and insane. And I'll admit, with Saw being called a torture porn genre, it took me quite some time before I ever even decided to delve into them. Gory horror is not necessarily my favorite genre, but I did eventually check out the Saw movies a couple years back, starting with the first one, and I should have checked out the first one a long time ago. I'll have to admit it's directed by James Wan, one of my favorite horror directors of all time. So of course I liked it, and it is not like the other Saw movies at all. It's actually probably the most different Saw movie in terms of feel, so it might actually be the one most disconnected from the franchise in some ways. But it's also the one that started it all, and it is one of my favorite horror movies that I've seen, I would have to say at this point. I did end up watching Saw 2 and 3. I didn't think Saw 2 was that bad, although it was starting to become what I wasn't really caring for, which was emphasizing more on the torture elements. And then I'll just have to admit Saw 3 didn't vibe with me at all. I know some people do like this one, but the convoluted plot just was a little ridiculous in my opinion, and it was just becoming more just a gore fest than anything else. And I'll admit, after that, I didn't check out any of the other Saw movies. I was intrigued to see that a new Saw movie was coming out after all this time, and I'll admit the trailers intrigued me even more, with it seeming to be having more of an emphasis on John Kramer, aka Jigsaw himself, as the main character instead of the victims that we've seen in all the other movies. So, what is Saw X like? How does it fare? Let's talk about it. So, if you didn't already know, and hopefully this isn't too much of a spoiler because the trailers do give this sort of plot synopsis. John Kramer is diagnosed with cancer. He has been for quite some time, and it is a terminal form of it. He is in stage 4. This should not be a spoiler at all. If you've seen the other Saw movies, you know that is part of his history. Also, I guess I should go out and say this right now because this is important to the context of the movie, but this one takes place in between 1 and 2, in my understanding. He feels like his life is basically over at this point, and he doesn't know what else he can do. He feels like he has lost the will to fight. But he eventually gets in touch with the Peterson family, the Peterson doctors, this husband and wife duo, who claim to be able to do these life-changing surgeries to cure anyone of any type of cancer, no matter how far along it is. And John Kramer, of course, sees this as a new lease on life, a new chance for him to appreciate and live longer than he is. And so he goes to Mexico to get this procedure, but a lot of red flags are popping up that, from the audience's perspective, makes it seem like maybe these doctors aren't all they seem to be, and the people working with them. And of course, later on we find out that that is the case. Of course, John Kramer is not too happy by this, and he captures all of the people who were part of the scam and puts them in a classic Saw scenario. I want to play a game and all that good stuff. And then the Saw that we've come to know and sometimes love commences from that point forward. So, let me go ahead and start out by saying that this movie sort of surprised me with how it was structured. For the first part of this movie, it is actually a fairly calm and straightforward film, and almost has a sort of indie film feel to it, which is very weird to say for a Saw movie. It's much more of a personal and introspective journey at first. This one very much is so about John Kramer, and it's about him as the man, not just as the serial killer Jigsaw. It is very interesting. It was certainly a very risky choice for the director of this movie to decide that he wanted us to sympathize with this man who we've seen be complicit in so many horrific acts over the course of 9 previous movies. But to this movie's credit, it somehow works. And maybe that's because John Kramer is such an interesting sort of killer compared to other slashers that we encounter. Ones like Michael Myers or Freddy Krueger or Jason, we don't really get to see them as humans very often. And for ones like Michael Myers, in my opinion, I think that actually works and plays towards the purpose of who their characters are. And I would debate that the same can go for John Kramer, that a part of his character that makes him unsettling is that he does have a lot of humanity to him. And I think the movie does manage to make you feel for him without having to knock you over the head with over-the-top pathos. They just tell a good story, and you feel for him when you realize, oh, he's getting scammed, isn't he? These doctors aren't actually going to cure him, no matter how much he wants to believe it. And he's going to not be in a good place by this time. And we can see the sort of progression of how his character is going to eventually become Jigsaw again, how he's eventually going to capture them. There seems to be a potential in this movie where maybe if the cure did work, maybe he wouldn't be going back to that lifestyle. But because we know the inevitable is going to happen, the path is all too clear of what's going to happen. This time, the victims that John Kramer is torturing, I think for maybe the first time, at least in the movies that I've seen, I don't know about the other ones, he has a personal investment and a personal reason for why he's torturing these people. They actually did something to him personally. They burned him personally. And they did something that was pretty scummy, I will admit. I think that makes us a lot more invested in the story. The fact that John does have some sort of attachment to why he's torturing these people. And that might make the feeling of it be all the more brutal and hard to watch in some places because we know. And the way he interacts with the victims is also very interesting. We don't always see him in the other Saw movies. And once again, I say in the first three, I don't recall him directly coming out in person and talking to the victims, but he does in this one. And that makes it so much more interesting. It feels so much more in the moment and so much more visceral in that way. I don't know why the movies didn't take advantage of doing this earlier, of having a Saw movie, be from the perspective of John. It makes all too much sense, and if we really think about it, it is him who has carried this series on his back. He's really always been great in all the ones that I saw, even as much as I didn't like the other some aspects of Saw 2 and especially Saw 3. I always thought that he was great in them and that if anything he deserved more screen time. So making him the main character here, just a great choice. Flat out the best part of this movie. I think it's hard to debate that. Also interesting is how this movie sort of develops the character of Amanda, who has been previously known in other Saw movies as just sort of Jigsaw's psychotic assistant. We know that she was in a trap of his own in the first movie when she was suffering with drug addiction, and that she eventually developed a sort of Stockholm syndrome for Jigsaw himself, believing that his torture saved her life, which in a way it sort of did. She decided to live on after the fact and not do drugs anymore. It is interesting here to see her given a little bit more humanity, in my opinion, whereas in the other movies, we only ever really saw one side of her, in my opinion. Whereas in this one, she's actually having some objections to what Jigsaw does. She even asks him a couple times in the movie if it's really worth it for him to do this, if this is really going to solve the suffering that he's been through. And it's interesting to see her have those debates with him. And he captures someone in the movie who is also a drug addict, and she has some problems with torturing this person because she remembers being in that position herself. That's just something else that makes the movie so intriguing, as we get to see the perspective of these two characters who have moral codes that are just so twisted on their head, and the things that they do are just not something that a normal person at least would consider doing, but they are able to justify it, and we are in a very twisted, once again, way, I don't know how else to say it, we're able to see from their perspective why they think that way, because the movie does such a good job of putting us in their heads. And I really like that about the movie. We don't get to see many slasher movies of this breed, this mainstream, that go into the killer's psyche and why they do what they do. And I think that is just such an interesting part of this movie that also makes it work very well. And of course, let's talk about the reason that everyone comes to these movies for the most part, the traps and the torture. Now, in this one, I will say that it is not like the first Saw in that they keep things vague and cut off when there's ever any amount of gore, really. No, in this one, they keep the gore pretty front and center, and it's pretty brutal to watch at times. There's some pretty memorable traps here, although I won't say that there's any quite as creative as even some of the traps in Saw 2, I would debate, were maybe a little more twisted than the ones we saw in this one, but I think the traps for what they were really worked, and they were all cleverly done in a way that reflected how John Kramer was scammed in each part of his cancer treatment procedure. The first trap in particular, I really do think that they did very well on that one. The first one was, in my opinion, the toughest to watch, just because of how much it was just so bloody and gory, and I think it worked very well. The second trap was pretty twisted too, although it didn't show as much. And I think the third and last trap were fine, but maybe probably the weaker ones in the movie, even though I did understand why John Kramer was using those traps. On the inverse side, I will say probably the weakest part of this movie, well, one of the weakest, is that we are not really invested in the people getting tortured. Now, I could say that this is a weakness of a lot of the other Saw movies. The only one, in my opinion, where I was super invested in the victims was the first Saw, in my opinion, and maybe a couple of the victims in the second movie, but overall the characters in the traps have never been that interesting of victims, and it's never been like you've been rooting so hard for them to get out. At least for me, that was the case. Some people might have different views on that. So that's not really too different in this one. At least these characters in this one are somewhat semi-developed, and you sort of get to know them. You don't really care either way whether they survive the trap or whether they don't. But I will say that this is also somewhat forgivable because the movie is once again focusing on John and Amanda, not the victims. I will also say that writing-wise, this movie can get a little bit on the nose and a little bit cheesy, but I mean, once again, that has been the case for Saw even from the beginning, in my opinion. I mean, in the first movie at the end, John Kramer says game over, which is an A-tier cheesy line, in my opinion, but cheese has always been a part of the Saw franchise. John Kramer has always been a showman. That's who he is, and of course he's going to be a little bit cheesy in that regard. There are some lines in this movie that I do think are a little bit on the nose, or where they're just hand-feeding stuff to you, when there could be stuff that would be just implied and work just as well, in my opinion. Also, the ending movie twist, it make it a little bit messy. They don't make it everything entirely clear, although you always stay to the end of Saw to see how Jigsaw has planned everything out like a elaborate puzzle piece, an elaborate game, and that he's always been one step ahead of everyone in terms of setting up the traps, and when people think they've beaten him, they really haven't. And while it may be a little convoluted here, I do still like it and still do find it pretty fun. So yeah, overall, Saw X was an incredibly pleasant surprise. I was not expecting to like this movie nearly as much as I did. I am not, like I said, a big fan of the torture porn genre at all. I do tend to think that gore is just not the most interesting form of horror, but somehow here, they just make it work. You can feel the tension, and they do a good job of building it up, and it doesn't feel as over the top as maybe some of the other Saw movies do. And the traps at least feel somewhat tangible. And it's also helped this movie has a legitimately compelling story, that it builds up John Kramer's character in a pretty interesting way, and it was interesting to watch the movie from his twisted perspective. I really liked that part of the movie a lot, as well as the relationship between him and Amanda becoming legitimately sympathetic in some parts. It's crazy to say that, but somehow they just make it work in this movie, so kudos to them for that. I'm going to be giving this a strong 3.5 out of 5 stars. I can't believe I'm saying this, but this might be one of the stronger horror movies of the year. So yeah, that was my review of Saw X. What did you think about this movie if you've seen it? Leave your comments in the comments section down below. And once again, my name is James, and I do reviews of both music and movies, along with the occasional commentary piece. If any of that sounds interesting to you, then please leave this video a like and subscribe to my channel to see more content like that. But until then, I will see you on the next video.